I'm going to ask you to do something unusual before this video begins. I'm going to ask you to be patient, because what I have to show you today is not a policy announcement. It is not a tariff. It is not a leaked document with 14 sections and 5 pillars and projected trade volumes. It is something far simpler than any of that. And because it is simple, because it is just 5 words on a single sheet of paper, I need you to understand everything that came before it before I tell you what it says. I need you to understand the 14 months of quiet diplomacy, the 4 a.m. press releases, the hand-delivered documents, the market crashes and the emergency meetings and the 11-minute cabinet sessions that ended with a president standing up and saying, "Figure it out." I need you to understand all of it, because 5 words mean nothing without context. And these 5 words, with context, mean everything. At 7:44 this morning, a Canadian diplomatic courier arrived at the West Wing entrance, carrying a single sealed envelope. It was marked only with the Canadian Prime Minister's personal seal. No government letterhead, no agency routing, no diplomatic pouch. Just a seal, an envelope, and a courier who handed it to a security officer and walked away. Protocol requires letters of this kind to be processed through the State Department. This one bypassed state entirely. It was hand-delivered directly to the Chief of Staff, and when the Chief of Staff opened it and read what was inside, he set it face down on his desk and immediately cleared the room. For the next 4 hours, the White House said nothing. No statement, no tweet from Trump, no press briefing, no background comment to any reporter, no signal of any kind from any official at any level of the executive branch. In Washington, 4 hours of silence from this White House is not nothing. It is the loudest possible alarm. I'm going to show you what was in that envelope. I'm going to show you who leaked it and why, and what the leak itself tells you about the state of the American government right now. I'm going to show you what the markets did in the 11 minutes after the leak dropped, and why a senior analyst at JP Morgan told his clients that the market wasn't reacting to the letter, but to the realization that the letter was true. I'm going to show you Trump's response, the 3 hours of silence, the golf tournament post, and the meeting where he looked at his advisors and asked the one question none of them would answer. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what comes next, including the one where Congress physically takes the wheel away from the driver. But first, the build-up. Because Carney didn't write this letter on a whim. He wrote it when it was true. And making it true took 14 months. Subscribe right now. Stay with me. The 5 words are coming. And when they arrive, you will understand exactly why they landed the way they did. Think about what Mark Carney has done in the past 4 months. He flew to Brussels and stood next to the President of the European Commission and announced an emergency economic partnership that gave Canadian goods preferential access to the largest single market on earth, while the White House was celebrating what it thought was Canada's capitulation. He fast-tracked pipeline and port construction on the British Columbia coast using national economic security powers, building the infrastructure to redirect Canadian energy to Pacific buyers on a timeline that American strategists said was impossible. He released a joint statement with India at 4:07 in the morning, a $847 billion trade framework that replaced the United States as Canada's primary trade partner for the first time in 3 decades, announced while Trump was asleep and the NSC had no warning. He connected the EU Digital Alliance, the India Framework, the Pacific Energy Corridor, and the Governors' Regional Cooperation Agreement into an interlocking architecture that covered energy, critical minerals, technology, agriculture, and defense. Each move was a brick. Each deal was a wall going up. And each time, Washington either dismissed it, misread it, or found out about it from a cable news push notification. Sources close to the Prime Minister have told journalists that the letter, the one sitting face down on the Chief of Staff's desk at 7:44 this morning, was drafted 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. It was written, reviewed, held. Not because Carney wasn't ready to send the message, because Canada wasn't yet ready to mean it. He was waiting for the architecture to be complete, waiting for every alternative to be signed, every partnership to be formalized, every brick to be in place. The India deal was the last brick. When it closed, Carney opened a drawer, took out the letter, and sent a courier to the West Wing. That is not impulsiveness. That is not emotion. That is a man who spent 14 months building something, and then, when it was finished, quietly informed the person it was built against. At 11:52 in the morning, the full text of the letter appeared simultaneously on Reuters, the Associated Press, and the BBC. 3 wire services, 3 separate sources, 3 separate countries, same moment. This was not an accidental leak. Accidental leaks don't happen on 3 continents at the same time. This was a coordinated release. Someone, or several someones, made a decision that the world needed to know what was in that envelope, and they made sure there was no way to contain it once they pulled the pin. The Reuters source was described as a senior White House official with direct knowledge of the letter's contents, who believes the American public has a right to know what their government received this morning. A senior official. Again, the second major leak of internal White House documents in this crisis, both from people who looked at what they were seeing and decided their oath to the country mattered more than their loyalty to the administration. The AP source was a Congressional Intelligence Committee member who had been briefed within the hour. That means the letter had already moved beyond the Chief of Staff's desk to Capitol Hill. And someone on Capitol Hill decided the public should see it before Congress could decide what to do about it. The BBC source was inside the Canadian government. Read that carefully. Ottawa was a source for the leak. The Canadian government, or someone inside it with Carney's implicit blessing, fed the text to a British wire service at the same moment American dissenters were feeding it to Reuters and the AP. This letter was always meant to be read by the world. The courier was just the first delivery. Reuters, AP, and BBC were the second, third, and fourth. The letter was not leaked against Carney's wishes. It was always a public document wearing the costume of a private one. Here is what the letter says. 1 sentence. No letterhead, no date, no salutation, no signature, no diplomatic language, no pleasantries, no conditions, no offer, no door left open. 5 words. We don't need you anymore. That is the entirety of Mark Carney's communication to the President of the United States this morning. 5 words on a single sheet of unfolded paper, hand-delivered by courier, bypassing the State Department, landing face down on the Chief of Staff's desk at 7:44 a.m. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the temptation is to move immediately to analysis, to market reaction, to Trump's response, to what it means geopolitically. Resist that temptation for just a moment, because the sentence deserves to be heard on its own terms first. We don't need you anymore. Not, we are unhappy with current arrangements and seek renegotiation. Not, Canada reserves the right to pursue alternative partnerships. Not, further escalation will be met with proportional response. Not any of the language that fills the thousands of pages of diplomatic communication that have passed between these two governments over the past 4 months. Just that. 5 words. The most consequential period in the history of North American diplomacy, sitting at the end of a sentence that took Carney less than 10 seconds to write, and the United States a century to earn. Diplomatic analysts in London, Brussels, and Tokyo were on television within the hour. Every single one of them used the same word: terminal. Let me explain why these 5 words, and not the India deal or the EU partnership, or any of the larger and more complex moves Carney has made, are the ones that broke Washington this morning. Carney has a doctorate in economics from Oxford. He ran the Bank of Canada. He ran the Bank of England. He has sat across the table from the most powerful financial institutions in the world and never blinked. He understands something about power that the current occupant of the White House does not. In negotiation, the most devastating thing you can communicate is not anger. It is not a counter threat. It is not a demand or an ultimatum or a deadline. The most devastating thing you can communicate is indifference, because anger implies that you still care about the outcome. Anger means the relationship still matters enough to provoke an emotional response. We don't need you anymore is not anger. It is a closing statement. It is the words you say at the end of a conversation, not the middle. It is what you say when the deal is already done, when the alternatives are already in place, when the dependency that the other party was counting on has been quietly, methodically, brick by brick, dismantled. Every previous Canadian response to Trump's pressure was a countermove. A tariff for a tariff, a deal for a deal, a threat for a threat. Countermoves happen inside a game. They acknowledge the rules. They accept the framework. They say, I am playing, and I am playing to win. This letter is not a countermove. It is a withdrawal from the game entirely. It says, I am no longer playing, not because I lost, because I no longer need to play. That is a distinction that the markets understood immediately. That is a distinction that allied governments understood immediately. That is a distinction that Republican senators in border states understood, privately and with dread, the moment they read the Reuters wire. The question Trump asked his advisors at 3 p.m. today was the right question. It was the only question. Is it true? Do they actually not need us? Nobody answered. Stay with me, because the market reaction to those 5 words is something you need to see clearly, because it tells you more about the real state of this crisis than any political analysis can. U.S. markets had been open for 2 hours when the leak dropped at 11:52. The morning session had been relatively calm, nervous but calm. Traders were watching, waiting, processing the India deal from earlier in the week. The mood was anxious but not panicked. That changed in 4 minutes. Within 4 minutes of the Reuters wire, the Dow Jones had fallen 890 points. Within 11 minutes, it was down 1,340, the fastest 1,300-point drop in exchange history, not triggered by a natural disaster or an act of war. Energy futures collapsed as traders moved Canadian supply redirection from tail risk to base case. The Canadian dollar surged against the US dollar, a movement that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Gold hit a new all-time high for the 3rd time this week. 3 separate algorithmic trading systems triggered automatic circuit breakers as bond market movements exceeded their program parameters. By 2 p.m., an estimated $2.3 trillion in global market value had been erased. Not because of a new tariff, not because of a policy announcement, not because of an economic data release, because of 5 words on a piece of paper delivered by a courier at 7:44 in the morning. A senior analyst at J.P. Morgan released an emergency note to clients. 1 sentence. The market is not reacting to the letter. The market is reacting to the realization that the letter is true. That sentence from J.P. Morgan is the key to everything, because the letter's power is not rhetorical. It is not about Carney's tone or his word choice or the drama of the single page and the personal seal. The power is empirical. The power is that the market, which processes information without ego, without loyalty, without ideology, looked at 5 words and concluded they accurately described reality. Canada does not need the United States the way it did 6 months ago. The EU partnership is real. The India framework is signed. The Pacific Energy Corridor is under construction. The Governor's Agreement is in place. The Digital Alliance exists. The architecture is built. The $2.3 trillion that evaporated this afternoon evaporated because traders ran the same calculation Carney ran 3 weeks ago when he drafted the letter and got the same answer. Now let me show you Trump's reaction, because it is, in its own way, as revealing as the letter itself. Trump did not post on social media for 3 hours and 17 minutes after the leak, his longest silence during waking hours since taking office. Not 3 minutes, not 30, 3 hours and 17 minutes. The man who has averaged 11 posts per day since returning to office, who has posted during funerals and state dinners and international summits, went silent for 3 hours and 17 minutes. When he finally posted, it was about a golf tournament. 40 minutes later, a second post. The fake news is misrepresenting a private communication between 2 world leaders. Canada is desperate and everyone knows it. Sad. He did not deny the letter's contents. He did not say the 5 words were fabricated. He did not say Carney never wrote them. He called it a misrepresentation without saying what was misrepresented. That is the language of a man who has been told by his lawyers not to deny something he cannot disprove. At 2 p.m., the press secretary faced reporters. She was asked 11 consecutive questions about the letter. She answered none of them directly. One reporter asked, "Does the president have a response to Prime Minister Carney's statement?" The press secretary said, "The president is focused on the American people." The room went quiet. Then someone in the back said, quietly but audibly, "That's a no." At 3 p.m., Trump convened an emergency meeting. According to 3 sources, he walked in, sat down, looked at the people across the table from him, his economic advisors, his national security team, the people whose job it is to tell him what is true, and asked one question: is it true? Do they actually not need us? Nobody answered. Not because they didn't know the answer, because the answer was yes. And no one in that room was willing to be the person who said it out loud to the President of the United States. The world responded to those 5 words. And the way the world responded tells you something essential about where American influence stands right now. The European Commission issued a statement within 2 hours. Canada's communication reflects a reality that the international community has been watching develop for months. The European Union stands with Canada. The UK Foreign Secretary called the letter historically significant and said it marks a turning point in the architecture of Western alliances. Japan's Prime Minister, at midnight local time in Tokyo, issued a personal statement praising Canada's strategic clarity. India's foreign ministry said nothing publicly, but Indian markets surged 2.4% on the news. Not a single G7 government issued a statement of support for the United States. Not one. In the entire world, across every capital, every ally, every country that has called Washington a partner and a friend and a guarantor of the liberal international order for 80 years, not one government said, "America is right about this." When the history of this moment is written, that silence from America's allies will be the sentence that stings most. Not the 5 words from Ottawa, the 0 words of support from every capital that used to answer when Washington called. 3 scenarios. Because the door is closed, but the building is still standing. And what happens next inside it will determine whether the damage is permanent or merely historic. Scenario 1. The unanswered letter. Trump never formally responds. The silence becomes the answer. Canada proceeds with full implementation of its alternative partnerships. The U.S.-Canada relationship enters a state of managed estrangement. Trade continues at reduced levels. Diplomatic contact is minimal and functional. And the deep integration that defined North America for a century slowly, irreversibly unwinds. Future presidents will spend decades trying to rebuild what 5 words and 4 years destroyed. Not because the will won't be there, because trust, once broken at this level, does not return on anyone's schedule. It returns when it returns, if it returns. And the generation that builds it will be the grandchildren of the people watching this video today. Scenario 2. The desperate reply. Trump, advised by a panicking economic team and furious border state governors watching their states' economies hollow out in real time, sends his own letter to Carney. It is long. It is detailed. It contains concessions that would have resolved this crisis 4 months ago. It arrives too late. Carney reads it, consults his cabinet, and releases a public statement. Canada notes the United States communication and will review it through the appropriate diplomatic channels. 11 words in response to pages of concessions. 11 words that are themselves a message. The power dynamic has permanently inverted. Canada is now the one making Washington wait. And Washington, having spent 4 months refusing to treat Ottawa as an equal, is now waiting. Without leverage, without options, without a move that doesn't cost more than the last one. Scenario 3, the breaking point. Congressional leadership, having watched $2.3 trillion evaporate in a single afternoon, having received calls from every major corporate donor in every border state, having read the polling and done the arithmetic, invokes emergency legislative authority to override Trump's trade powers. A bipartisan bill removing all Canadian tariffs passes both chambers within 72 hours. Trump vetoes it. The veto is overridden. For the first time in this presidency, Congress has physically taken the wheel from the driver. Trump calls it a coup. His base calls it treason. History calls it a correction. And somewhere in Ottawa, A man in a dark suit reads the wire, folds his hands, and says nothing. Because he already said everything 5 words ago. Here is where we are tonight. The letter exists. The 5 words are confirmed. The White House has not denied them. The markets have processed them and found them true. The allies have responded and found them earned. And the man who wrote them is not giving interviews, not holding press conferences, not appearing on television to explain himself or defend his choice or contextualize the moment. He doesn't need to. He wrote 5 words. He sent a courier. He waited for Reuters. The rest is silence. This is what strategic clarity looks like. Not volume, not fury, not the endless reactive posting and threatening and doubling down that has defined one side of this conflict from the beginning. Clarity. A door, closing, a sentence, ending, a relationship, described accurately for the first time. We don't need you anymore. 5 words that took a century to earn and 14 months to make true. 5 words that moved $2.3 trillion in a single afternoon. 5 words that the President of the United States could not deny, could not respond to, could not explain away, and could not, sitting in an emergency meeting at 3 p.m. surrounded by the most powerful advisors in the world, get a single person to tell him were false. Drop your comment below. Tell me what you think those 5 words mean for the future of this relationship. Tell me whether you think there is a path back from here, and if so, what it looks like. Tell me whether you were watching when it happened, because today I think is one of the days you will remember. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the letter has been sent, the door has been closed, and what happens next, whether it stays closed, whether someone fights to reopen it, or whether the entire building comes down, will be the story of the next chapter. I will be here for every word of it.